Get a life, Martha. You're not our retirement plan. I'm 72. I built 2 companies, buried my husband, raised our only son alone. But today, over burnt coffee and judgmental stares, I was just a burden. What would you do if your daughter-in-law humiliated you in public? Mother's Day brunch? Providence, Rhode Island. A live-in-time calf, Sunday crowd buzzing, clinks of cutlery, smell of over-roasted Arabica. I wore a simple olive wool dress. No designer label, no statement earrings. Just the scent of my late husband's cologne, still clinging to the scarf I wrapped around my neck. His scarf. The one he wore on our last spring walk before the chemo took everything. Noah sat beside Brittany. Silent, always silent. His eyes flicked toward the window as if the clouds outside could save him. Brittany, though, she leaned forward, lips glossed, teeth perfect. "You've been freeloading long enough," she said, raising her voice for the back table to hear. "Maybe it's time you consider assisted living. Or downsizing. We can't carry you anymore." A fork's dropped. A child turned from her pancakes to stare. Even the barista stopped mid-pour. I looked at Noah. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Not a single word, not even my name. The walls suddenly felt too close. The smell of sugar and cinnamon turned acidic. I felt the hem of my dress between my fingers. Wool scratchy, familiar. I inhaled. Slow, heavy. Like my chest had turned to stone, Brittany crossed her arms, sipping orange juice through a gold straw. "Honestly," she added, "you're embarrassing. Look at your dress. Look at this whole vibe." She twirled her fingers mockingly. "Not brunch material." I set down my coffee. The cup chipped at the rim. The handle wobbled. Then I spoke. "That's interesting, dear, because I own this cafe." Her smile froze. Someone at the next table gasped. I pulled a folded document from my handbag. Soft creases. Legal typeface. One word in bold across the top, lease agreement. "I also own the building you and Noah live in." I continued calmly. "The penthouse you love so much. That's my signature on the contract." Brittany blinked. Once, twice. Noah finally turned to me, his voice low, unsure. "You never told us?" "No," I said, "because I was waiting to see how you'd treat someone you thought had nothing." I paused. Let the silence settle in like fog. Then I added, "Now I know?" The Brittany opened her mouth, but no words came. Only the sound of a spoon stirring too fast in a nearby glass. I stood, adjusting my scarf, letting it fall gently across my shoulder. The same one Henry kissed before every courtroom victory. I smoothed the lease paper, tucked it into my bag, and looked around. "Every eye in that cafe. My cafe was on me." "I've drained nothing," I said. "But you? You've emptied respect." Then I left. Folks, what would you do if the family you loved treated you like charity? Would you forgive or fight back quietly? Tell me below. The first time Henry called me brilliant, I just fired our biggest client. Respect, I told the boardroom, can't be negotiated. I was 43, CEO of Lindell Human Capital. The men around the table blinked in disbelief. Henry smiled from the glass door. Just once. That was enough. He always knew when I needed the strength he couldn't lend out loud. He gave it in looks, in coffee brought at 5 a.m., in rubbing my back during 3-hour board prep. Not a man of many words, but his presence was louder than applause. Back then, I ran through terminals in kitten heels, read contracts, white noise in hotel rooms, but I always flew back Friday night because Noah had swim meets. He was 8, asthmatic, beautiful. Henry did bath time, I handled morning meds. We played Gus the Quotation over breakfast. Noah always beat us both. When Henry fell sick, the meetings shrank. So did I inward. The board suggested a buyout. I signed it quietly 2 months after his second diagnosis. That morning, I sat by the fireplace watching him nap on the couch. The blanket rising, falling, like the tide that would never come again. I didn't cry then. I waited until the kettle whistled. In the box of tax returns after the funeral, I found the letter. Folded once, crisp ink on legal paper, typical Henry. If you're reading this, it means I've left. I hope you remember. You've never needed permission to take up space. Don't let them shrink you. I didn't frame it. I kept it hidden, between old training manuals in the closet. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready to believe it. Maybe I thought I'd never forget who I was. But memory is a slippery thing, especially when the house goes quiet, when holidays shrink from laughter to silence, when your son marries a woman who calls your presence excessive. I used to command rooms with just my voice. Now I sip tea alone, forgetting how my name used to echo in conference halls. But that letter? That one sentence. It glowed brighter than any boardroom trophy. And I started to remember, Noah met Brittany at a friend's engagement party. She wore red, talked fast, laughed louder, introduced herself as content creator/brand stylist. I smiled politely, but inside, something tightened. She was all shine and certainty, acrylic nails and perfect posture. Noah softened around her like heat-melting shape. He started answering slower, filtering words through her gaze. Their wedding was modern, no hymns, no toasts, just vows read from a screen. I stood by the hydrangeas out of frame, my heels sunk into damp grass. No one noticed. 6 months later, she repainted their walls white, photos vanished, books disappeared, Henry's old watch boxed my portrait. Too heavy for the aesthetic, she said. The apartment felt like a showroom, curated, lifeless. She hosted Sunday brunches for her followers, filtered eggs, mason jar mimosas, white backdrops. Martha Lindell, former CEO, was reduced to knows mom who doesn't get Instagram. I was offered a stool near the coat rack, out of frame. One morning, Noah visited alone. Brittany stayed in the car. He asked if I'd considered selling my condo. Said maybe something easier for a woman my age. He didn't meet my eyes. I asked if Brittany had suggested it. He laughed too fast, said no. Then asked about my finances. That night I sat by the window with the old kettle. Rain tapped glass like it used to the night Henry came home with his diagnosis. But now there was only silence, no warm hand reaching for mine. No voice saying, "You decide, Martha?" So I did. I called a lawyer, moved every asset, cafes, stocks, buildings, into a trust under my brother Walter's name. Didn't tell Noah. Didn't tell anyone. After it was done, I stood in the middle of my living room. The sun slid through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the wood. I felt both powerful and hollow. I started shopping at discount stores, donated old coats, switched my perfume for soap, let my hair gray fully. I wanted to see who they'd be without my shine. Turns out, no one asked where it went. Brittany stopped pretending, corrected my stories, rolled her eyes at my jokes. At one dinner, she said, "Martha, that story again? We've heard it." Noah passed the salt without looking up, but the first real slice came 2 years ago. We were at a cafe, Chrome, minimal solace. The waiter greeted me warmly, said he'd seen me on a local business board. I thanked him, smiled. Brittany leaned in, her voice syrupy low. "Maybe don't talk too much, Martha? You ruin the aesthetic?" Noah sipped his coffee. That was the moment I realized. They weren't forgetting me. They were erasing me, and I let them. The second brunch came nearly a year before the Mother's Day explosion. Same cafe, same candles, same curated chaos Brittany called ambience. She wore pastel this time. I came in olive again. The hostess glanced at my scarf, unsure if I belonged. Brittany didn't wave me over. She pointed at the seat nearest the window, furthest from the camera tripod.
"Martha," she said, already mid-photo.
"Hope that sweater's not wool. Lighting picks up texture. You know?" Noah was scrolling through his phone. His thumb moved, but his eyes didn't. A waiter brought water. I reached for the menu. Brittany slid it away. "We're doing pricks fixed today. Clean look, easier captions." She placed a sprig of rosemary over her plate like it was a prop, not a herb. I nodded, sipped my water. She leaned closer across the table, voice soft but certain. "Maybe next time, neutral tones, creams, grays. Something that won't clash." I looked down at my hands. Veins. Wrinkles. My wedding ring still on. "This cafe," she continued, smiling toward her followers behind the phone. "Such a clean brand. We don't want to disrupt the feel, do we?" The word stuck, disrupt. I had once disrupted hiring norms across the Northeast. I'd been quoted in Harvard Business Review. Now, I disrupted brunch photos. Noah finally looked up. I held his gaze a moment too long. He looked away. My chest felt tight, not from shame, from something else. A kind of invisible crushing. I thought of Henry's letter. "Don't let them shrink you." I swallowed hard, smiled tight, tucked the scarf under my coat sleeve. Brittany turned to her phone again, narrating. "Brunch vibes with family. Grateful Sunday. Hashtag gratitude. Hashtag legacy. What a word. I wondered if mine would be filtered out like my laugh, like my stories, like my presence. Was that how it ended? Not with cruelty, but with curated indifference. The waiter came to clear the first course. Brittany said, "Can we skip hers? It doesn't plate well." I felt the fork in my hand. Cold. Heavy. Useless. Noah said nothing. He cut into his toast like it was any other day. And that's when something inside me shifted, not shattered. Not yet, but it cracked. A seam I didn't know I was still holding tight. I turned to him. "Quai no," I said. He looked up. I waited for a word, a glance, anything. But he just blinked and went back to chewing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the kitchen window, hands curled around a chipped mug. Steam rose in faint spirals. Outside, wind rattled bare branches. Providence in February always felt like a held breath. I thought of the first time I pitched to a boardroom. 12 men? One woman me? They questioned my numbers, doubted my projections, chuckled at my voice. I didn't blink. I walked out with the contract. I used to command silence. Now I lived in it. At brunch, I'd looked at Noah and thought, he'll say something, anything. A word. A breath. Even his name on my lips felt like sandpaper now. But all I got was the scrape of toast against plate. It wasn't Brittany's insults that haunted me. It was his absence. The quiet betrayal of someone who once whispered, "Love you, Mom. You're my compass." I didn't expect loyalty over marriage, but I didn't expect erasure either. When Brittany said, neutral tones, I remembered the navy suit I wore the day Henry proposed. He said I looked like I could run the Pentagon, and I nearly did. I built hiring frameworks used in 5 states, spoke on panels, sat beside senators, once flew to Atlanta to settle a strike. I negotiated peace over stale coffee and dry muffins, but now I was an unwanted extra in Brittany's filtered frame. Legacy. The word kept echoing, not the hashtag. The real thing, what we leave behind, not what we pose beside. Was this what Henry meant? Don't let them shrink you. Had I shrunk? No, I'd gotten quieter, but I was still here. Still Martha Lindell, the woman who once rebuilt a team after half the firm quit. Who wrote her own bylaws because none fit her. Who taught Noah how to ride a bike in the rain because courage comes wet sometimes. Noah forgot, but I hadn't. I rose slowly from the kitchen chair, moved to the hallway closet, pulled down a worn binder, black, unassuming, filled with ownership records, leases, transfer documents, everything Brittany didn't know I still held. I ran a hand along the edge. Felt something settle in me. Not rage, not revenge, resolve. I would not shout. I would not fight. But I would no longer disappear. The next time someone asked what I brought to the table, I'd show them the deed to it. And as I turned off the kitchen light, the night no longer felt as heavy. It started with a folder, blue glossy, tucked between Brittany's designer planner and a half-finished matcha. She slid it across the table like it was nothing more than a brunch menu. For peace of mind, she said, sipping her drink. Just in case, anything ever happens. Health-wise, I looked at the tab, a family protection form. Kanoa cleared his throat, didn't look up. Brittany continued, her voice sweet as syrup. This isn't about money, Martha. It's just a precaution. It gives us the ability to make quick decisions if needed. Hospital permissions, small asset moves, medical directives, that kind of thing. I nodded slowly. She said small, but the document felt heavy in my hands. Stapled thick, no cover page. Legal-sized paper. I'd seen this format before, too many times. As a consultant, I'd reviewed dozens like it. Disguise power of attorney documents with softened language. Pretty labels, ugly teeth. My fingers traced the margin. Font size 8. One paragraph halfway down page 2 was bolded, but slightly smudged. Misaligned. Like someone inserted it after the fact. I thought we already had something like this on file, I asked. Brittany tilted her head. Oh, that.
Old, outdated.
This one's cleaner and cleaner. Noah finally spoke. It's no big deal, Mom. Just sign and we can forget about it. Just sign. That phrase. I once fired a VP who used those same words to coerce a junior associate into waiving her bonus rights. He called it streamlining. I called it manipulation. I set the pen down beside the folder. I'd like to read it carefully. Brittany blinked, then smiled too quickly. Of course. No rush. Take your time. Just maybe before the end of the month. There it was, the edge. Wrapped in sugar, but sharp underneath. I'll look at it this week, I said. Then I folded the folder shut, deliberately, slowly. Later that night, I placed the document on my dining table, turned on the overhead light, sat down with a magnifier I hadn't used since Henry's will. Page 3 referenced liquid assets. Page 5 mentioned joint decision rights for real estate relocations. The language was blurry, but the intent wasn't. They weren't preparing for my illness. They were preparing for my exit. What struck me most wasn't the document itself. It was the signature line, typed below Martha J. Lindell, but in the faintest gray shadow behind it another name, a Walter Lindell, my brother. Long gone, but very much relevant. My eyes narrowed. This wasn't just sloppy copying. This was someone fishing for authority. Without realizing, they were swimming in my waters. I closed the folder. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt alert. There was something here, something they missed. The next morning, I walked to Olive in time before opening hours. Jill was already inside, arranging pastry trays with the same precision she brought to every task. She'd been with me for 12 years. Long enough to read my moods by the way I held my purse. "You're early," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Then, softer, "You're not here for muffins." I handed her the blue folder. Said nothing. She flipped through the pages. Frowning, her glasses slid down her nose as she leaned in. "Who drafted this?" she asked. "Brittany," I said. "No, delivered it?" Jill snorted. "Of course she did." Kishi held up one page to the window light. "See this?" She tapped the edge. "This isn't original layout. They cut and pasted lines badly." I pointed to the name Walter Lindell. Jill's brows drew together. "This was built from an old trust file, wasn't it?" I nodded. She crossed to the back room, returned with a slim black binder. The old trust structure. Jill kept copies of everything. It was how we survived audits and lawsuits. We compared side by side.
Fun. Different spacing. Off date.
Missing 2 compliance lines. But it was the margins that gave it away. Brittany's version was 1.15 inches right aligned. The original? A clean 1-inch lock. Jill's signature style. "This isn't just a bad copy," Jill murmured. "It's intentional. Someone wanted it to pass as familiar, but not enough to invite legal review." I looked down at the stapled mess. The smudged clause. The language about relocations. Dressed in soft phrasing. "Do I confront her?" I asked. Jill looked at me. Not like a friend. Not like a former assistant, like someone who remembered who I was. "You never confront noise," she said. "You outlast it." I closed the folder, slid it back into my bag. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the safe behind the pantry. The combination stuck for a moment, my fingers trembling, not from fear but from memory. Inside the original trust deed. The last thing Henry signed before he died. His initials. My brother's name. The clean seal. A single sentence at the bottom in Henry's handwriting. "Control never dies. It waits." I held the paper to the light. Ink still sharp, corners still crisp. Outside, Providence was gray and slow, but the document glowed faintly under the kitchen bulb. I didn't feel old. I felt exact. Let them think I was slow fading. Let Brittany believe she'd played the long game. She wasn't even on the board. I placed the original deed back in its envelope. Tucked it deep, beneath old cookbooks no one opened anymore. Then I turned off the light and smiled, not because I had won, but because, finally, I had re-entered the game. The house was unusually quiet for a Sunday. No text, no call, not even a group photo with Ava's lopsided smile. I boiled water, set 2 cups, then remembered Henry was gone, and today, I was not invited. Later, while folding laundry, I found it. A piece of notebook paper folded twice tucked in the inside pocket of my coat. Ava's handwriting, rounded, uneven. "Fanana, I saved you a cupcake." They said you were too tired to come. But I know you weren't. At the words sat heavier than any insult Brittany had thrown. I held the note longer than necessary, long enough for the ink to blur beneath my fingers. I went to the kitchen, set the note beside the kettle. The light outside shifted. Shadows climbed the wall like vines. "Family cupcake brunch." Their caption from last year had read only those closest. Closest? I once memorized Noah's class schedule by heart. Packed lunches with little sticky notes. "You've got this? Love, Mom." Stayed up through fevers, standardized tests, college essays. But now I was too tired, according to them. Too tired to sit at a table I once built. I opened the fridge. Half a tangerine, a bottle of cream gone sour. Silence. Years ago, Sundays smelled like cinnamon in Henry's aftershave. His voice booming over the radio. "Turn it down, Martha! You'll break the speakers." I never did. I touched the counter where he once leaned half asleep, hair askew. He used to steal the first pancake, called it Chef's privilege. Now the only sound was the soft buzz of the refrigerator. Steady. Indifferent, I sat down. Iva's note still in my hand. She had noticed. She knew I wasn't tired, just not wanted. There's a difference. My chest tightened, not with anger, but something quieter. A kind of fading. They hadn't yelled. Hadn't pushed me out the door. They simply moved the party without me. Noah hadn't even sent a picture. I reached for the second cup on the table. Poured tea for 2. Old habits, I suppose. Then I looked at the empty chair across from me, where Henry used to sit, where Noah once kicked his feet, swinging too high for the floor. Now, just linen and silence. I took a sip. The tea was too bitter, or maybe I was. I stared at the napkin beside the plate. Still folded, still clean, waiting for someone who wouldn't arrive. Funny how erasure never shouts. It whispers. Soft, consistent, polite, and one day you realize they've stopped remembering what your voice sounds like. I leaned back. The air didn't feel cold, but something inside me was freezing. The message came at 3:17 p.m. Hey? Call me when you can.
It's about Brittany. Jill, I called.
She answered on the first ring. She called this morning, Jill said. Asked for documents related to cafe ownership. I stayed silent. She said you've been forgetful, that you might need help managing things. The words hit softer than expected, but deeper. Forgetful. It wasn't just a word. It was a strategy. She framed it sweet, Jill added. Concerned daughter-in-law. Wants to take pressure off your shoulders. Said you mentioned struggling with recent tasks. I let the silence sit. Did I sound confused the last time we met? I asked. Jill scoffed. Martha, you recited 3 lease clauses by memory. That wasn't the point. Brittany wasn't collecting documents. She was building a case. I ended the call. Sat back in the armchair. Felt the leather cold against my spine. The room around me blurred, not with tears, but with thought, sharp, silent, fast. This was no longer brunch warfare. This was structural erosion. They wouldn't throw me out. They'd make it look like I wandered, unfit, forgetful, graciously replaced. I stood, moved to the hallway, pulled down the black box, Henry's old campaign files. Inside pens, legal pads, dates, stamped envelopes. I placed a fresh notebook on the table. Opened it, smoothed the first page. Then I wrote, keep records, don't react yet. CA lesson I learned from Henry during the union dispute of '98.
Don't flinch. Don't fuel. Just document.
I thought back. 2 weeks ago. Brittany asking twice if I'd already told her the brunch time. Don't worry, we'll keep it simple for you. Last month she offered to label my pillbox. Said, we don't want you doubling up by mistake. Noah had laughed, I didn't. I added those to the list. Itemized, dated, neutral phrasing. Not because I wanted revenge, but because no one listens to memory. They listen to paper. I poured myself tea again. This time it didn't taste bitter. I wasn't angry. I was awake. For too long, I'd been shrinking quietly in the name of peace, letting kindness be mistaken for confusion. But not anymore. They wanted me silent. Still, grateful. Instead, I picked up the pen and kept writing. The theme was spring bloom, balloons in pastels, paper butterflies hanging from invisible strings, everything curated, everything perfect. I arrived 5 minutes early, holding a gift wrapped in newspaper. Brittany hated the look of printed ink. Said it ruined the palette. She met me at the door, didn't smile. Oh, hi, Martha, she said. Can I ask a tiny favor? She didn't wait for a yes. Maybe hang back a bit today? Just, blend. Ava's got a whole pastel vibe going on. She gestured vaguely toward the dining room. I looked down at my coat. Olive wool. Again, always olive, always wrong. Children ran past with icing on their hands. Lauder spilled like soda from every corner of the apartment. In the middle of it all stood Ava, pink dress, frosting on her cheek, happiness unfiltered. When she saw me, she beamed. Nana! She ran over and took my hand. Come stand by me when I blow the candles. Brittany froze.
Honey?
She said through clenched teeth. We talked about keeping things simple in the photos. Remember? Ava frowned. But Nana brought the candle I asked for. I had a beeswax taper with little flowers etched in the side. A silly tradition from Henry's old law office parties. One Ava loved. Brittany sighed, loudly. The kind of sigh designed to draw a crowd. Okay, seriously? She said, turning toward me. Can we not do this right now? I felt the room shift. Lauder paused. A plastic cup fell somewhere behind me. She's 7, Brittany? I said softly. But Brittany didn't lower her voice. You always make it about you? Every single time. She stepped closer. This is my child's party, not your stage. Noah stood by the drink station, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of punch he hadn't sipped. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't look at me. I think. Brittany continued. It's best if you go. For Ava's sake. Ava clutched my hand tighter. I bent down, kissed her temple. I'll see you soon, love, I whispered. I straightened, met Brittany's eyes, and for a long moment, said nothing. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out a folded paper, thick stock, embossed seal, lease agreement, Penthouse Unit 12A, Brittany's current address. My signature still valid. I held it just long enough for her to recognize the header, then slid it back in.
Button my bag. Noah watched.
His jaw tensed. I turned to the door. Behind me, I heard Ava begin to cry. Not a tantrum, just quiet confusion, soft and honest. Like Henry once said, children always spot the truth before adults finish lying to themselves. I left the party without a word. But inside my bag, the deed to her ceiling stayed warm in my palm. I didn't change when I returned home, still in the olive dress, still holding the bag with the lease agreement. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. No hum of a party, no laughter. Just the sound of the door clicking shut behind me. I walked straight to the kitchen, set my purse down on the counter, unopened. The air smelled faintly of old cinnamon, something left too long in the cupboard. Familiar stale. I poured a glass of water and stood by the sink. Not thirsty, just needing to do something. My reflection in the window stared back. Same face, same lines. But the eyes had changed. I went to the shelf above the desk and pulled down an old photo album. Near the back, Noah's 6th birthday. We had baked the cake together. Henry wore a paper crown, playing harmonica off-key. Noah laughed with chocolate on his cheek, arms wrapped around my neck. He had begged me to wear my red scarf because he said I looked like a superhero. I touched the corner of the photograph. That little boy wouldn't have watched me be asked to leave. He wouldn't have stood still and let me be erased. But the man in that apartment, he had. I placed the photo face down. Then, I sat at the desk and opened the laptop I hadn't used in months. Inbox still intact. I clicked Compose. Subject property consultation urgent at Message Dear Alan. Hope you're well. I'd like to review the lease structure and ownership documents for Unit 12A. Please let me know when you're available this week. Warm regards, Martha Jake. Lindell. I clicked send. No second thoughts, no hesitation. Then I opened a new document.
Blank. White.
Type game board reset. Assets confirmed. Leverage in hand. Witnesses ready. Emotion anchored. I saved the file under a new folder labeled Simply Mayplan. I sat still for a long while. I hadn't spoken back at the party, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't embarrassed anyone, though Brittany clearly hoped I would. Instead, I had shown her a paper, my name above hers, her home under my signature. That was the beginning. The quietest kind of answer. I stood, poured the untouched water into the sink. Then I returned to the living room and took out Ava's birthday card, the one she had given me a week earlier, decorated with hearts and tiny drawings of bees. Inside, in pencil, love you, Nana. You make the best candles. I don't care if your dress is green. I like green. I folded it carefully, placed it inside the black notebook where I kept records now. Not because I needed protection, but because I wanted to remember. The truth once written becomes harder to deny. Outside, the wind moved the curtains gently in the distance. A porch light blinked on. The world kept going. And so would I. For years, I had made myself smaller, smiled through dismissal, chose peace over presence. But tonight, something had shifted. Not bitterness, not revenge. Something steadier. Clarity. I looked out the window at the skyline, at buildings with names no one knew I owned, at a life they had tried to shrink. They forgot. I don't fade, I endure. And for those listening, have you ever been pushed out of your own family? What would you do? I waited until night. Not because of fear. Because quiet helps the truth stand up straighter. I spread the old trust binder across the kitchen table. Jill had kept every original. Thank goodness. Pages dated, notarized, crisp despite the years. Section 4 caught my eye. Henry's handwriting appeared in the margins, steady and small. Amendment. All decisions regarding estate control shall be deferred unless cognitive impairment is diagnosed and verified by 2 independent professionals. I read it twice. Then again. The language was clear. Not vague, not open to interpretation. Unless I was legally proven unfit, no one, not Noah, not Brittany, not the state, could touch the assets. Henry hadn't just built a trust. He'd built a firewall. A safeguard not against thieves, but against those who smile while taking. I leaned back, hands folded on the table. The light buzzed overhead. The refrigerator hummed behind me. Stillness all around. But inside, something burned. So that's what this had been. The careful comments? The "did you already tell me this?" With the gentle offers to handle appointments, label pills. They weren't kindnesses. They were breadcrumbs, leading to a story I never agreed to. The narrative of fading. Of fragility. Of being someone who needed to be managed. I wasn't offended. I was insulted. I had written HR policies tougher than this. I had fired men who tried to gaslight their way around accountability. Now they were trying to soften me into surrender. Package it in brunches and birthday themes. But the ink hadn't faded. Henry's note remained. Ink still bold, margins still tight. He had known. Even then, even sick, he saw it coming. They would try to control me not with force, but with doubt. And if I ever doubted myself, they'd win. I reached for the next page. Underlined in pencil, "By if they try to erase you, remember, the ink is still yours." I stared at that sentence, not poetic, not polished. Just truth, Quiet and stubborn, like Henry. I thought about Ava, her little hand in mine. The way she frowned when I left the party. She didn't care about aesthetics. She cared about presence. That meant something. Still, I turned the page, placed a sticky note beside the clause, then closed the binder, not out of fear, out of readiness. They had begun their plan. But so had I. And this time I wasn't waiting to be invited. I was the architect. I stood, rolled my sleeves up, and picked up a pen. Not to fight, to document, to remember. Because legacy doesn't speak in hashtags or edited photos. It speaks in handwriting left behind, and voices that refuse to disappear. The next morning I made tea. No olive dress, no pearls, just a soft gray cardigan and clean intention. I sat at the desk by the window. Pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Not for the court. Not for Jill, not even for Noah. For me. A letter to myself. Dear Martha, you are not disappearing. You are not confused. You are not fragile. You are still you. You remember the red scarf Henry loved. The client in Atlanta who cried in your office. The way Ava's nose crinkles when she's thinking hard. You remember birthdays and names and the sting of watching your son become a stranger. That pain, it proves you're alive. You are not anyone's burden. You are not a placeholder at the table. You are the table. Let them underestimate you. Let them build their stories, but hold the truth like breath in your chest. Because it is still yours. Love, I signed it, folded it, placed it in an envelope and wrote the date on the front. Then I opened the calendar app and booked an appointment. Comprehensive medical review, neurological evaluation, cognitive baseline testing. I chose the clinic 2 towns over, one with no ties to Brittany's influencer circles, no accidental run-ins. The nurse on the phone was kind, said she could squeeze me in next Tuesday. I thanked her. Twice. After the call, I gathered my documents, ID, insurance, past health reports, and placed them into a new folder, labeled it in small handwriting. Vital, private, protected. I added the letter I had written, not because it was evidence, because it was anchor. Later that afternoon, I walked through the apartment with a clipboard, noting where everything was: the original deed, the trust copy, the sealed letter Henry left, the flash drive Jill had given me. Everything had its place. Everything labeled. Control isn't noise. It's quiet preparedness. As the sun dipped past the neighbor's roofline, I lit a candle. Not for mood. For memory. I let it flicker on the table beside the folder. The flame moved slightly in the draft from the window. But it didn't go out, and neither had I. I sat with the folder in my lap, ran my hand across the grain of the manila surface. Inside were documents, records, words. But more than that, proof. Proof that I still saw clearly, that I still planned sharply, that my legacy would not be rewritten in someone else's font. I took one final note that evening, wrote it in block letters on a clean index card. They may talk over me, but they'll never write me out. I placed the card in the front pocket of the folder, closed the flap, snapped it shut, and exhaled. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the armchair by the window, wrapped in Henry's old cardigan, the one he used to wear on Sundays when the news was too loud and the world too fast. Outside, the streetlight flickered once, then steadied. The letter was folded into thirds, tucked behind the original trust papers. I had found it after the funeral. Read it once, folded it again. Too raw to revisit, but not tonight. My hands were steady now, not because I wasn't hurting, because I was finally ready to remember. I unfolded the page. His handwriting leaned right, still bold, like it refused to disappear. If you're reading this, I'm likely gone. But knowing you, you probably waited until the moment was right. You never do things half-formed. You're stronger than all of them. Even when you feel soft. Especially then. They will try to define you by what you've stopped doing, what you've stepped back from. Don't let them. You have nothing to prove. But if they forget who you are, remind them what you've survived. You've stood in rooms where no one wanted you to speak. And you rewrote the script. And if you need to sit down for a while, sit. But don't you ever hand them your chair. I loved being in your orbit. Even when I couldn't keep up, you were the storm in the shelter. Still are? Yours H. I didn't cry. I had the first time. Right there in the driver's seat outside the funeral home. Tears fell onto the steering wheel like drops from a faucet that wouldn't tighten. But tonight I didn't cry. I breathed. Long, deep quiet. I read the letter again. This time aloud. To the room. To myself. To whatever part of Henry still lingered in the folds of that cardigan. When the sun came up, I dressed slowly, brushed my hair, wrote a note to myself. Bring the letter. At the cafe, Jill was arranging fresh muffins behind the glass. I waited until she finished stacking the last one. then held the letter out. She took it, unfolded carefully like it might tear. She read in silence. Eyes never left the page. No questions. No commentary. Just a small nod at the end. She folded it again, handed it back. I placed it in my purse. We said nothing more. Words weren't needed. We both knew. This time, I wouldn't fold it away. The walk home was quiet. Providence was still shaking off the early chill, but I didn't feel cold. At home, I removed my coat, poured a fresh cup of tea, and opened my notebook. A clean page. I drew a line down the center. Left column action, right column purpose. Line 1, contact Alan, confirm title review. Purpose, establish sole authority. Line 2, bank meeting, secure statements and signatory authority. Purpose, prep misuse or redirection. Line 3, Jill, scan and copy original trust and Henry's handwritten amendment. Purpose, timestamp and archive outside household access. Line 4, medical clinic, collect cognitive assessment results. Purpose, disarm manipulation attempts. Line 5, Ava, set aside private letters. Unsent. Purpose, legacy, truth in her hands. Someday. I paused. Not everything needed a reaction, but everything needed a record. I picked up the phone. Dialed Alan. He answered after 2 rings. Morning. Martha? I heard the familiar creak of his old office chair. That sound always made me feel like I was standing on firmer ground. Is this still a good time? I asked. For you? Always. I told him I wanted to move forward with full review, leases, titles, the cafe entities. Mentioned Brittany's increasing interest. He didn't ask questions, just said, let's get it all tightened up. We set the appointment. Thursday morning. His office. My time. Next, I called the bank. Scheduled a review of signature cards and access rights. The woman on the line asked if I'd like a financial advisor to sit in. No, I said. Just someone with a printer and a witness. After hanging up, I pulled out the old black binder one more time. Jill's copies were already inside. Everything alphabetized, labeled, preserved. I added a fresh document sleeve for the medical letter once it came. Even left a tab labeled, in case they push. That made me smile. I stood and walked to the mirror by the hall. Straightened my scarf. I hadn't really looked at myself in weeks. Not directly. The woman looking back was older, yes, but her eyes were sharp, her jaw still set with the old steel. I wasn't just surviving this. I was assembling it. They'd underestimated me. Believed the quiet meant retreat. Believed stepping back meant surrender. But I'd simply been watching, not shrinking, not fading, waiting. I touched the mirror frame. Henry had built it years ago from reclaimed barnwood. It had never hung quite straight. Neither had I. And yet, here we were. I walked back to the kitchen. The tea had cooled. Still, I took a sip, bitterness gone. Nothing but clarity now. I reached for the folder labeled Mayplan and slid in today's checklist. Before closing it, I added one more note. In ink, no erasing. I am not waiting to be asked in. I own the door. The first move was silence. No phone calls, no warnings. No changes visible from the outside. Just the quiet removal of support. The joint household account Brittany used for groceries and bills, closed. The backup credit card Noah kept for emergencies, disabled. The auto transfer for Ava's private lessons, paused. Not erased. Paused, let them notice the shift before they trace it back. I gave the bank no explanation, just a notarized signature and a calm smile. When Brittany called that afternoon, I didn't answer. She texted twice, then stopped. By day 3, she called Jill. I'd instructed Jill to take the call. Record it. Document it. Jill answered with her usual dry warmth. Oh, hello, Brittany. Yes, I'm still here. I sat in my kitchen, tea in hand, listening on speaker. There seems to be a mistake, Brittany said, her voice coded in performance. Some of the cafe deposits are delayed, and Noah's card was declined at the vet. Jill's tone didn't shift. Well, I wouldn't know about Noah's card. But if it's the deposits, maybe Martha's just revisiting her records. She does that sometimes. A pause. Okay, Brittany asked. As in, is her mind still working right? I closed my eyes. There it was again. The campaign of doubt seems sharp to me, Jill replied. She's been organizing documents every day this week. Color, coded, even. A longer silence. Then the edge began to show. This is honestly ridiculous. She's creating chaos for what? Some power trip? Jill remained neutral. Not sure. You'd have to ask her. I'm trying. Brittany snapped. But she's not responding. We should have done this guardianship thing sooner. Click. Jill ended the call. I wrote it down in my notebook. Line 32. We should have done this guardianship thing sooner. Brittany, recorded call, 20:17 p.m. The evidence wasn't in the volume. It was in the pattern. Quietly, I was building a structure they wouldn't see until it surrounded them. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was protecting myself. For years, I had financed brunches, birthday balloons, new lenses for Brittany's branding work. I had done it without bitterness, because I thought that was what love did. But love doesn't mean blindness, and support doesn't mean surrender. The next morning, I sent Jill an updated instruction sheet. Record all Brittany's calls. Log every question about funds. Flag any mention of mental health, capacity, or permission. Jill sent back a one-word reply. Understood. I sat in the cafe corner booth later that afternoon. Watched the customers come and go. A young man opened his laptop. An older woman asked for oat milk. A child dropped a muffin and cried. Life in motion. And I didn't feel like someone avenging a wound. I felt like someone sharpening a pencil. They thought the silence meant surrender, but silence is where the real stories begin. She showed up unannounced. Brittany, white coat, oversized sunglasses, manicured fury. Pushed through the cafe doors like it belonged to her. Jill caught my eye from behind the counter. I nodded once. Stay neutral, Brittany asked, voice sugar-dipped, teeth clenched. I set down my tea? Of course, I said. Just not here? I led her to the small office behind the kitchen, where Henry and I used to tally receipts on Sundays. She walked in, arms folded. Didn't sit. I'm going to keep this simple, she said. Noah's trying his best to keep this family together, and you're sabotaging everything. I didn't respond. You've cut off funding, frozen accounts, and now you're ignoring everyone like some Victorian martyr? Still, I said nothing. She took a step closer. If this is about respect, fine. Here it is. You raised a good man. He's overwhelmed, I'm overwhelmed. But this Cold War you've started? It's not sustainable. I opened a drawer, took out a sealed envelope, placed it gently on the table between us. She stared at it. What's that? Something for someone else, I said. Not for you. Her nostrils flared. You're pushing us away. You'll regret this. Eventually, you'll be the one calling. I stood. You're done, she said, turning toward the door. This family's done with you. I followed her to the cafe floor. Jill handed me a receipt to sign. We didn't mention the scene. Brittany left with a final flick of her coat, as if fabric could erase footprints. Back in the office, I picked up the envelope. Addressed Alan Kessler, attorney at law. Inside of the transcription of the call Jill recorded, and a brief handwritten note. Alan, please review attached transcript. Subject Brittany Lindell, statement re guardianship intent. Suggested next step formal preemptive declaration of competency. Let's meet Friday. Thank you, MJL. I sealed the envelope, placed it in the outgoing tray. Then I locked the office door, turned off the light, and leaned against the wall. The silence wasn't heavy. It was earned. Years ago, I would have argued, defended myself, begged Noah to speak up. But not now. Now, I understood the difference between being feared and being forgotten, and I had no intention of being either. I stepped outside. The cafe smelled like warm bread and citrus peel. Someone had ordered a chamomile tea. The world hadn't ended. It had simply tilted. And I had chosen my footing. Back at the table, I opened my notebook, wrote one more line. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it signs documents. I looked out the window. A father was tying his daughter's shoes on the bench outside. She giggled when he double-knotted them. And I thought, maybe Ava would ask about all this someday. Maybe I'd tell her, or maybe I'd just show her what dignity looks like when it stands its ground in silence. So I ask you, what would you do if your family tried to erase your mind to take your name? The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Hand-delivered. Cream paper. Gold seal. Noah picked it up like it might bite. Brittany was in the kitchen, slamming drawers again. The sound echoed sharp against the tile. Probably just some old cafe permit, she said, pulling out a packet of turmeric pills she never took. Noah turned the envelope over. His name was written in blue ink. The handwriting wasn't Martha's. It was colder. Legal. He opened it. 3 pages typed. Header Alan Kessler, attorney at law. Subject formal request for clarification of roles and fiduciary duties related to the Lindell Living Trust. He blinked. Read it again. The language was careful but clear. Due to recent activity suggesting possible breaches of beneficiary scope and undue influence, this office requests immediate clarification from all listed parties. Brittany turned. What is it? She asked a little too fast. He didn't answer. She walked over, drying her hands on a linen towel, reached for the letter. Noah didn't move, just passed it to her quietly. She read quickly, her lips pressed into a line. Then, she laughed. This is theater? Noah looked at her. Is it? Brittany didn't like that tone. She's bluffing. It's all smoke. Legal noise to scare us. I mean, look at the wording. Possible breaches, clarification. It's not even a threat. He picked up the second envelope, the one that came with it. It was from Martha. Tied with a soft gray ribbon, inside, copies of trust papers, Henry's signature on the amendment, a scan of a joint founding certificate. A photo. Him at 17, standing next to Martha outside the original cafe. Banner above them, Reedy opening day. Lindell and Son, his own handwriting on a plaque said to Mom, the real boss behind the counter. He remembered making that. Remembered how Martha had hugged him that morning. She lets people overlook her, he said aloud, quietly. On purpose. Brittany narrowed her eyes. What does that mean? Noah didn't respond. He was staring at the photo again. Martha's smile wasn't wide, but solid. Like she knew something no one else did. Brittany's voice sharpened. We need to file something first. Preempt this. Petition for financial mediation or... No, interrupted. Do you think she's really slipping? What? Mental decline? Do you believe that? Brittany hesitated. Then, she's 72, lives alone. Repeats stories? That's not mental sharpness, Noah. He looked down at the documents. Everything was precise, dated, notarized, nothing about it seemed confused. And then he saw it. A handwritten line on the corner of Martha's letter. Neat, centered. This isn't war. It's clarity, he swallowed. The words didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like truth. And suddenly, all the months of silence, the cut-off payments, the canceled lessons, they didn't feel random. They felt intentional, measured, like chess moves made 6 turns ago. Brittany slammed the papers onto the table. Well, say something. Noah did. But not what she expected. I think we underestimated her. Dinner was quiet. Ava picked at her pasta, pushing the peas into neat rows. Noah barely touched his plate. His mind kept circling back to the letter. And to the photo? To that ribbon Martha had tied gray, like her favorite sweater. Brittany cleared her throat. So, she said a little too brightly, we're going to respond, right? Submit a counter letter? File for joint oversight? Noah looked at her. You mean fight her? Brittany rolled her eyes. I mean protect what's ours before she twists everything in her favor. You really think this is about clarity? Come on. Ava glanced up. What's going on with Nana? Nothing. Brittany said quickly, too quickly. Just grown-up stuff? Noah sighed. She's not suing us, Britt? She's setting boundaries, Brittany scoffed. Boundaries? She's shutting us out. Cutting off accounts. Embarrassing us with legal drama like we're thieves. She's not accusing us. She doesn't have to, Brittany snapped.
She's maneuvering Noah.
Silently, like she always does. Ava put down her fork. I miss Nana. Brittany ignored her. We have to get ahead of this. Ava's school fees are lease. It's all tied to her. If she goes off the rails, we're the ones left scrambling. Noah leaned back. His voice was lower now. Are you worried about Ava's school? Or your brand deals? Brittany's mouth opened. Then closed, then opened again sharper. Don't you dare twist this. I've supported this family while she played silent queen in the background. She built all this? Noah said. I made it visible. Brittany shot back. She's just a bitter old woman clinging to power she doesn't even use. A fork dropped. Ava's, her eyes were wide. The room froze. Brittany turned. Oh, sweetheart. But Ava stood up. Don't talk about Nana like that, she said quietly. Noah didn't speak. He couldn't. Ava walked out of the room, closed her door gently behind her. Brittany stood there stunned. Noah picked up the plaque photo again. Ran his finger across the words he wrote at 17. To Mom. The real boss behind the counter. He looked at Brittany. Really looked. And for the first time, he didn't recognize her. Not fully. That night he couldn't sleep. Ava's door was still closed. He stood outside it for a while. Then returned to the living room, turned the envelope over one more time, and stared at Martha's handwriting. This isn't war. It's clarity. He finally understood, and it terrified him. He came just before closing. The cafe was nearly empty. The last customer had taken their coffee to go. Jill wiped the counter slowly, then stepped into the back. Noah stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes tired. I didn't speak. He sat across from me. A beat passed. Then he asked, Why now? I tilted my head. He didn't mean the trust. Or the accounts. He meant the silence. The shift. I didn't answer, not with words. Instead, I reached under the counter, opened the drawer I'd labeled stormproof, pulled out 2 folders. I placed them on the table, one on top of the other. He looked down. First, a transcript. Jill's recording. Brittany's voice clear as a bell. We should have done this guardianship thing sooner. Second, a copy of Henry's handwritten clause, the amendment protecting my control, unless legally proven unfit. Noah didn't move at first. Then slowly, he reached for the documents. His hands were steady, but his face said otherwise. He read the transcript first. Lips pressed into a line, then the clause. I watched his eyes pause on Henry's words. Only if cognitive impairment is diagnosed and verified by 2 independent professionals. He read it again, then again. Finally, he looked up. Did you know? Back then. I nodded once. He set the papers down gently.
No drama. Just wait.
He stared at the grain of the table, the rings in the wood. Brittany said she was protecting me. I didn't answer. She said you were slipping, that we had to act before something irreversible happened. Still, I said nothing. He looked at me then. Really looked. What if I believed her? I met his gaze. Then you weren't listening closely enough. He didn't argue, just sat there. The cafe smelled of closing time. Old coffee, citrus soap, warm bread gone cool. Outside, the streetlights flicked on. One by one, Noah took a breath. Is it too late to do the right thing? I didn't flinch. Only if you let it be. He nodded once. Not a promise, but maybe a beginning. He rose, tucked the transcript under his arm, left the clause on the table. As he reached the door, he paused. Ava had drawn a B on the chalkboard earlier that day. Still there, yellow chalk smudged. Noah touched the frame lightly, then walked out. I sat still. I wasn't waiting for an apology, just for clarity. And now, finally, it had begun. Brittany found out 2 days later. Noah hadn't told her he went to see Martha. She heard it from Jill, by accident, over coffee. They were standing in line at the juice bar. Jill mentioned how quiet things had been since Noah's visit. Brittany froze. When they got home, she slammed the fridge door so hard the magnets fell. You went to see her, she said, voice trembling. Noah didn't respond. You didn't tell me? You didn't even? Why? What did she say? Still nothing. He sat at the kitchen table, elbows on knees, staring at the tile. Brittany paced, hands slicing the air. Did she lie to you? Did she cry? Play the victim again? Or did she bribe you with some fake emotional inheritance? Noah looked up. Finally, she showed me papers. What papers? Henry's trust clause. The guardianship attempt, your words. Transcribed. Brittany's eyes widened. She recorded me. She protected herself. Brittany's face twisted. For a moment, she didn't look angry. She looked scared. She's manipulating you. She always has. Noah didn't answer, just stood up and left the room. After that, the silence between them wasn't peaceful. It was sharp, cutting. Noah slept on the couch. Iva stopped asking questions. Brittany stopped waiting. On Friday, she filed the petition, emergency guardianship. She cited progressive cognitive issues, erratic financial decisions, and isolation from family. She paid the expedited fee, told herself it was the only way to protect what was left. But 3 days later, the letter came. Official typed. Stamped. Brittany opened it in the living room, hands trembling. Her eyes scanned the page once, then again, then slower. Petition denied. On grounds of insufficient cause. Supporting documentation provided by respondent indicated full cognitive capacity, verified by 2 independent specialists. Filed 1 week prior, attached were notarized assessments. Cognitive functioning normal, executive decision ability intact, emotional resilience above average. She dropped the pages onto the floor. They scattered across the rug like broken glass. Noah walked in, saw the papers. Didn't pick them up. She looked at him. You knew. He nodded. She filed first. Brittany opened her mouth. Closed it again. She sat down slowly. No more shouting. No more pacing, just her. A letter and a door that had quietly closed behind her. Outside, wind brushed the windows. Inside, the silence settled. Noah stood for a while, then walked into Ava's room without a word. Brittany didn't follow. For the first time, she realized Martha hadn't taken anything from her. She had only refused to give more. The email came just after sunrise. From Alan. Subject line, guardianship petition status. I didn't rush to open it. I stirred honey into my tea. Fed the birds on the porch. Let the light shift across the kitchen floor. Then, slowly, I sat down. Clicked. Petition has been formally denied. It read, grounds pre-filed medical clearance and lack of supporting concern. No follow-up action required. That was it. No fanfare. No courtroom. Just clarity on paper. I closed the laptop, took a long sip of tea. Jill arrived an hour later. I handed her a copy of the letter. She read it silently, then gave a slow nod. No surprises, she said. Only timing? I replied. She placed the page in the archive binder, alphabetized, filed, locked away. By noon, the cafe smelled of cinnamon and rosemary. Someone ordered a lavender scone. Ava would have liked that. I went into the office, closed the door behind me, opened the bottom drawer, the one I hadn't touched in months. Inside, a manila folder labeled, "For Ava." I pulled it out, laid it flat on the desk. Then I began to write, not a legal defense, not a counterattack, just a summary. 4 paragraphs, the trust, the clause Henry added, the petition Brittany filed, and the reason it didn't succeed. No anger, no blame, only facts. I printed the page, folded it carefully, slipped it into a white envelope. On the front, in cursive, it to Ava. "One day, this may help you understand." I placed it back in the drawer. Underneath the folder titled May Plan. I closed it, locked it. Outside, the espresso machine hissed. A customer laughed at something Jill said. I stood, walked to the restroom, washed my hands, then looked in the mirror not to adjust my scarf, not to fix anything, just to look. The woman staring back had silver strands at her temples, soft lines beneath her eyes. But she was clear. She was still here. I leaned forward slightly. "What does power sound like?" I whispered, "when it doesn't need to raise its voice?" No answer came, only quiet. And in that silence, something steady. I returned to the cafe floor. Jill raised an eyebrow. "All settled," I nodded. "Settled doesn't mean finished," I said. She smiled. "No, it just means you're in the part where people start asking the wrong questions." I chuckled, tied on my apron. By late afternoon, the lavender scones were gone. And I was more than fine. I was prepared. It had been a month. No new letters, no calls, no visits. But also no demands, no more papers in the mail, no silent threats wrapped in legal tone. I stopped waiting the second week, not out of anger, but because waiting is a form of attachment, and I had finally begun to detach. The peace wasn't loud. It didn't cheer, but it filled the quiet corners of my day. Every Saturday at 10 a.m., I hosted a workshop in the cafe's back room. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Financial Clarity for Women 65." No one asked me to start it, but they came anyway. Lucille, who used to be a librarian in Warwick, brought her blue folder marked SOS. Jeanette came every week in a navy hat and asked the same question 3 times, but always laughed at herself. Marcia, who once gave away the deed to her home to keep peace, cried when we explained how to take it back. They didn't need charity. They needed vocabulary and proof they weren't crazy for wanting control. I didn't tell them my story, not directly, but every time I explained what revocable meant, or demonstrated how to label accounts payable on death, they understood I had once been the woman on the losing end. We used clipboards and Sharpies, drank lemon tea with honey. Some days we practiced scripts for hard conversations, how to say no without apology. I kept it simple, never promised power, only clarity. This Saturday the group stayed longer than usual. It had rained earlier, and the warmth inside made people linger. We laughed over a story someone told about her son trying to make her sell her car. He said I should Uber everywhere. She smirked. I told him to Uber his ego back in to check. Laughter filled the room. When they finally left, I moved through the tables, collecting mugs and wiping crumbs from the wooden chairs. The cafe had gone quiet, that soft, honest silence at the end of a full room, and then I saw it. A small note, folded twice, left beside the tea tray. No envelope, just purple ink. Block letters, slightly slanted. I opened it. "Cover next week too?" I've on my breath caught. Her handwriting. Still round, still careful, a little hard over the eye. I stood there for a while. Didn't cry, didn't call anyone. I just held the note, felt the edges against my fingers, pressed it lightly to my chest. Then I walked to the office, opened the drawer marked "For Ava," and slipped it in, right above the summary I'd written for her. I closed the drawer, locked it, and smiled. Not because everything was healed, but because something had finally begun. The following Saturday she came, no warning, no knock on the glass, just the soft creak of the cafe door at 9:57 a.m. She wore a denim jacket and her school backpack. No, it wasn't with her, I didn't ask. Just pulled another chair into the circle. Ava sat down quietly, notebook in her lap. Lucille gave her a wink. Jeanette offered her a lemon drop. I began like usual, whiteboard marker in hand. Today's topic: how to appoint a financial proxy without losing autonomy. Ava didn't speak, but she wrote. Small, focused strokes. She sat next to me, elbow barely brushing mine, not seeking contact, just anchoring herself there. During the break, she wandered near the counter. Jill handed her a chamomile cookie. She said thank you. Nothing more. By the end of the session, the chairs were scattered with paper notes and empty mugs. The women left slowly, a few at a time. A hug here. A reminder to bring your account list next week. There. Ava stayed seated. I gathered the last clipboard, wiped the whiteboard, then walked over and placed a small cloth-bound notebook on the table in front of her. Dark blue. Blank pages. On the inside cover, I had written one line. In case you ever need a place to write your own version, says she opened it, read the line twice, then looked up. Her eyes were steady, older than before. Not afraid, just aware. She closed the notebook, held it to her chest. Then, slowly, without a word, she leaned forward. Anne wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't a tight hug, not rushed, just quiet. We sat like that for a moment. My hand rested gently on her back,
I didn't cry?
but something in my chest loosened. Like a knot I'd stopped noticing had finally slipped free. When she pulled back, she gave the faintest smile. I'll come next week, too, she said. I nodded. She picked up her backpack, notebook still in hand. Walked toward the front door. Jill held it open for her. Outside, the light had shifted. Late afternoon sun slanted through the window panes, long and golden. It cast two shadows on the far wall. Hers and mine. One tall, one just behind it, slightly smaller, but overlapping, perfectly. No one spoke, no music played, just the sound of the bell above the door, soft as memory. And for once, I didn't feel like I had to narrate anything. The story was already speaking for itself.